Before he was an old man in a worn coat sitting alone by a restaurant window, Vittorio Belandi was a name that made grown men lower their voices in fear. There was a time when Vittorio Belandi did not ask questions twice. Men who owed him money were found within hours, never within days. Rivals who tried to expand into his territory disappeared so quietly that even their own families stopped searching after a week. He built one of the most feared criminal empires in Italy, not with loud threats, but with cold, patient silence, the kind of silence that told you the decision had already been made before you even knew you were in danger. Police feared him. Judges avoided his name in their courtrooms. Even other mafia bosses, men who ruled entire cities with blood and fear, chose their words carefully whenever Vittorio Belandi was in the room. And yet, decades later, that same man walked into a small, quiet restaurant in Naples, dressed like a stranger with nothing, and sat down alone by the window across from a young waitress with tired, careful eyes. He had no money on him that night. Not a single coin. And when the bill came, his hands trembled with a shame that men who feared him for 30 years would never have believed possible. She had no idea who she was speaking to. She had no idea that the same trembling hands in front of her had once signed off on decisions that ended men's lives without a second thought. That single act of kindness, given to a man capable of unimaginable danger, was about to pull a simple waitress from a forgotten street in Naples into the center of one of Italy's most feared family empires, and into a war she never asked to be part of. Before we continue, welcome back to the channel. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you do not want to miss what happens next. Drop a like, and in the comments, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now where you are. Now, let's go back to where it all began. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of slow evening where the restaurant was almost empty and the smell of tomato sauce and fresh bread filled the air. Giulia Moretti wiped down the counter for the third time, not because it was dirty, but because she needed something to do with her hands. The bell above the door rang. An old man walked in. He was thin, his coat too big for his shoulders, his shoes worn at the edges. He sat by the window, alone, and looked at the menu for a long time without saying a word. "Good evening, sir," Giulia said, smiling. "What can I get for you?" Just a plate of pasta," the old man said quietly. "Whatever is simple." She brought him a plate of spaghetti with fresh basil, the good kind, the kind she usually saved for regular customers who tipped well. He ate slowly, like a man who hadn't eaten a real meal in days. When she came back to check on him, she noticed his hands were shaking. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Yes, he said, but his eyes told a different story. When the bill came, the old man reached into his coat pocket, then into his pants pocket, then back into his coat again. His face turned pale. I seem to have left my wallet," he said, his voice breaking with shame. "I am so sorry. I will come back tomorrow, I promise. Don't worry about it," Giulia said, cutting him off gently. No, I insist, I will pay." "Sir," she said, kneeling slightly so she could look at him at eye level, "tonight, this meal is on me. You don't owe me anything." The old man stared at her, stunned. His eyes, tired and gray, suddenly looked wet. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" he asked. Giulia shrugged, smiling. "Because my mother used to say, never let a hungry man leave your table. Food is the one thing you should never make someone beg for." The old man said nothing for a long moment. Then he stood up slowly, buttoned his coat, and looked at her one more time. "What is your name, child?" "Giulia. Giulia Moretti." He nodded slowly, as if committing it to memory, and walked out into the cold Naples night. She thought that was the end of it. She was wrong. 3 days later, a black car parked outside the restaurant. Then another. Men in dark suits stepped out, calm, quiet, watching everything with sharp eyes. They didn't come inside. They just watched. Giulia noticed them from behind the counter, and a chill ran down her spine. "Who are those men?" her coworker Sofia whispered. "I don't know," Giulia answered. But she had a bad feeling. That night, as she walked home, a car slowed beside her. The window rolled down. "Miss Moretti," a deep voice said. "My employer would like a word with you." Giulia's heart raced. "I don't know your employer. You fed him 3 nights ago. You refused his money." Giulia's breath caught. The old man. "Is he all right?" she asked, suddenly more worried than afraid. The man in the car studied her for a moment, surprised by her reaction. Most people, when approached like this, showed fear for themselves. She showed concern for someone else. "He is fine," the man said. "He would like to thank you properly. Will you come?" Giulia hesitated. Every instinct told her this was dangerous. But something about the old man's eyes that night, the loneliness in them, pulled at her heart. "All right," she said. "But if anything happens to me, people will ask questions." The man almost smiled. "Nothing will happen to you, Miss Moretti. I promise you that." The car drove her far outside the city, up a long road lined with tall trees, until they reached an enormous iron gate. Beyond it stood a mansion so large it looked like something from a movie. Stone walls, tall windows, a fountain in the front yard that sprayed water into the night air. Giulia stepped out of the car, her mouth slightly open. "Where am I?" she whispered. "Home of the Belandi family," the driver said simply, as if that explained everything. The name meant nothing to her then. It would mean everything soon. Inside, she was led through long hallways decorated with paintings and old photographs, until she reached a large sitting room. And there, sitting by the fireplace with a blanket over his knees, was the old man from the restaurant. But he looked different now. Cleaner. Sharper. Dressed in a fine robe, his silver hair combed back. Yet his eyes were the same, tired, and somehow grateful. "Giulia," he said, standing slowly. "Thank you for coming." You're rich?" she asked, still confused. "That night, you said you had no money." The old man chuckled. "That night, I wanted to see something. I wanted to see if kindness still existed in this world, or if it died a long time ago along with everything good in my family. I don't understand. My name is Vittorio Belandi," he said. "And you fed a man everyone believes is untouchable. You didn't know who I was. You didn't care. That is rare, Giulia. Rarer than you think." Giulia swallowed hard. Belandi. That name, people whisper it in the streets. "Yes," Vittorio said, his voice suddenly heavy. "They whisper it because they fear it. My family built an empire out of fear, out of blood, out of things I am not proud of. But you looked at an old man and saw a hungry human being. Not a threat. Not an opportunity. A human being." He gestured for her to sit. "I would like to repay your kindness," he continued. "Not with money. Something better. My son will be joining us shortly. There is something about you, Giulia, something I cannot explain yet. But I intend to find out what it is." Giulia didn't know it then, but that sentence would carry more weight than either of them understood. The doors opened, and a man walked in whose presence immediately changed the air in the room. He was tall, dressed in a dark, perfectly tailored suit, his face calm but his eyes sharp like a hawk studying its next move. Everything about him screamed control. This was Matteo Belandi. "Father," Matteo said, nodding at Vittorio, before his eyes moved to Giulia. He studied her the way a man studies a puzzle he doesn't yet understand. "This is Giulia," Vittorio said. "The woman who fed me when she thought I had nothing." Matteo's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes flickered. "So you're the waitress my father has not stopped talking about," Matteo said, his voice smooth, almost teasing. "I didn't know who he was," Giulia said quickly, feeling the need to defend herself. "I would have done it for anyone." "That," Matteo said, "is exactly why my father hasn't stopped talking about you. Most people who find out who we are start acting differently immediately. You didn't even know, and still, you helped him without expecting anything back. Is that so unusual?" Giulia asked. Matteo's lips curved into the smallest smile. "In my world? Yes. Extremely." Vittorio watched the exchange between them with quiet interest, his old eyes calculating something neither of them could see yet. "I would like you to stay for dinner," Vittorio said. "As my guest." Giulia glanced nervously between the two men. Every warning bell in her mind told her to run. But something, maybe curiosity, maybe fate, kept her feet planted. "All right," she said. "I'll stay." She had no idea she had just stepped into a war. Over the following weeks, Giulia found herself pulled deeper into the world of the Belandi family. Vittorio invited her back several times, always kind, always curious, always asking small questions about her mother, her childhood, where she was born. "Why do you ask so many questions about my mother?" Giulia asked one evening. Vittorio's face tightened for just a moment before he smiled again. An old man's curiosity. Nothing more. But it was not nothing. Vittorio Belandi had noticed something the very first night at the restaurant, a small mole under her left eye, the shape of her jaw, a certain tilt of her head when she laughed. Details that reminded him of someone from a long time ago. Someone he had tried very hard to forget. He said nothing yet. He wanted to be sure. Meanwhile, Matteo found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, thinking about a woman outside of business, outside of danger, outside of the family's endless wars. He began finding excuses to be at his father's estate whenever Giulia visited. He began asking his men to quietly ensure she arrived home safely after her shifts. He told himself it was simply protecting someone his father cared about. He was lying to himself. "You're distracted," said Antonio, Matteo's most trusted enforcer, one afternoon. Ever since the waitress started coming around. "I am not distracted," Matteo said coldly. Antonio raised his hands in surrender, but the smirk on his face said otherwise. That evening, Matteo found Giulia sitting alone by the garden fountain, looking up at the stars. You don't seem like someone who belongs in my world, Matteo said, sitting beside her. I don't belong in it, Giulia said honestly. I'm a waitress, Matteo. My mother cleaned houses until her hands bled. I grew up sharing one bedroom with 2 cousins. This, she gestured at the mansion behind them, this isn't my life. And yet, here you are. Here I am, she agreed, smiling softly. Matteo studied her for a long moment. Can I ask you something personal? You can ask. I might not answer. Do you know anything about your father? Giulia's smile faded slightly. No. My mother never spoke about him. Whenever I asked, she would change the subject or start crying. She died 4 years ago, and she took whatever secret she was hiding straight to her grave. Matteo's jaw tightened, though he didn't yet know why the answer bothered him so much. I'm sorry, he said quietly. It's all right, Giulia said. Some things aren't meant to be known, I suppose. She was wrong about that too. Weeks turned into a strange sort of routine. Giulia would work her shifts at the restaurant, and in the evenings, a car would arrive to bring her to the Belandi estate, where she would share dinner with Vittorio, and increasingly, with Matteo. What started as curiosity slowly became something else entirely. Matteo found himself laughing, actually laughing, during their conversations, something his own men said they hadn't heard in years. Giulia found herself looking forward to the drive out of the city more than she cared to admit. But not everyone was happy about this new closeness. Riccardo Belandi, Matteo's cousin and one of his most senior lieutenants, watched the growing relationship with narrowed eyes. Riccardo had spent 15 years standing just behind Matteo, never quite equal, always in his shadow, always the one who cleaned up messes but never received the credit. This waitress is a distraction, Riccardo said one night, during a private meeting with 2 other senior men, Carlo and Enzo. Matteo is losing focus. And a distracted boss is a vulnerable boss. What do you suggest? Carlo asked. Riccardo's eyes glinted in the dim light. I suggest we take advantage of that vulnerability. What none of them knew was that Riccardo had been planning something far bigger for years, a slow, patient betrayal designed to tear the Belandi empire apart from the inside, so that when it collapsed, he alone would be standing to pick up the pieces. The waitress, whoever she was, had just become a very useful tool in his plan. The first attack came on a rainy Thursday night. Matteo was returning from a meeting with a rival family when 3 cars boxed his vehicle in on an empty road outside the city. Gunfire erupted, shattering windows, sparks flying off metal as bullets tore into the car's armor. Down! Antonio shouted, pushing Matteo's head below the dashboard as their driver swerved hard, sending the car spinning off the road. For nearly 2 minutes, chaos reigned, shouting, gunfire, the screech of tires. Then, silence. Matteo's driver was dead. Antonio was bleeding from his shoulder. But Matteo, miraculously, was untouched. This wasn't random, Matteo said through gritted teeth, climbing out of the wrecked car. They knew our route. They knew our timing. Only a handful of people knew that route, Antonio said, wincing as he pressed a hand to his wound. Matteo's eyes went cold. Then we have a rat. The hunt for the traitor began immediately. Matteo interrogated his inner circle one by one, watching their faces, listening for hesitation, for fear that didn't match innocence. Days passed with no answers, tension rising like a pot about to boil over. It was Giulia, oddly enough, who noticed something first. That man, she said quietly to Matteo one evening, nodding toward a guard standing near the estate's back gate. He was at the restaurant 3 days ago. Watching. Not eating, not drinking. Just watching. Matteo's eyes sharpened. Are you certain? I remember faces, Giulia said. It's part of the job. That single observation cracked the case wide open. The guard, once questioned under pressure, revealed that he had been paid to report Matteo's schedule to an unknown contact, a contact who always communicated through Riccardo's personal assistant. Matteo felt his blood turn to ice. Riccardo, he whispered. But when confronted, Riccardo displayed nothing but shock and outrage. You think I would try to kill you? Riccardo said, his voice trembling with what looked like genuine hurt. Matteo, we are family. I would never. Someone close to me sold my schedule, Matteo said coldly. And it traces back to your assistant. My assistant acted alone, then, Riccardo said quickly. Perhaps he was bribed by someone trying to frame me. Think about it, cousin, why would I risk everything I have built with you? Matteo studied his cousin's face carefully. There was no visible lie there. But there was something, a flicker, gone as quickly as it appeared. I will find the truth, Matteo said finally. One way or another. He did not yet know how deep that truth went, nor how much of his own family's history was built on carefully constructed lies. While Matteo hunted for traitors, another storm was quietly gathering. Vittorio, unable to shake his suspicions about Giulia's resemblance to someone from his past, hired a private investigator, a quiet, careful man named Bruno who specialized in matters the family preferred to keep hidden. "I want everything you can find on Giulia Moretti's birth records," Vittorio instructed. Her mother's name was Carmela Moretti. "I want to know everything about her life before Giulia was born." Bruno returned 2 weeks later, his face troubled. "Sir, this is unusual," Bruno said, laying a folder on the desk. "Giulia's birth certificate lists no father. That is common enough. But the hospital records from her birth, they were altered. Someone paid to have specific pages removed from the archive, replaced with blank forms. And it wasn't recent. This happened almost 30 years ago." Vittorio's hands trembled as he opened the folder. "Someone erased her history," he murmured. "Deliberately. Carefully. Someone with resources." "There's more," Bruno said. "I tracked down an old nurse who worked at that hospital during that time. She remembered the birth, remembered because of how unusual the circumstances were. A young woman, alone, no family present, and a large sum of money paid quietly to hospital staff to keep the birth quiet." Vittorio's heart pounded. "Did she say who the mother was?" Bruno hesitated. "Carmela Moretti. And sir, she said the mother mentioned the father's name once, in a moment of pain during labor. She said it was." Before Bruno could finish his sentence, a sharp pain exploded in Vittorio's chest. He gasped, clutching at his shirt, his face turning pale as he collapsed from his chair. "Sir!" Bruno shouted, rushing to his side. By the time the ambulance arrived, Vittorio Belandi had slipped into a deep, unresponsive coma, the truth trapped inside him, unable to escape. The news of Vittorio's collapse sent shockwaves through the family. Matteo rushed to the hospital, his usual cold composure cracking as he stared at his father lying motionless, wires and machines keeping him alive. "What happened?" Matteo demanded, gripping the doctor's arm. "A severe cardiac event," the doctor explained. "Likely triggered by significant emotional or physical stress. We don't know if or when he will wake up." Matteo sat by his father's bedside for hours, silent, his mind spinning. What could have caused this? What had his father discovered? Bruno, terrified and unsure of what to do, eventually approached Matteo with the folder still clutched in his hands. "Mr. Belandi," Bruno said nervously, "your father hired me to investigate something. I think it's connected to what happened to him." Matteo's eyes narrowed as he opened the folder and read through the details, the altered birth records, the mysterious payment, the missing pages. "Who is he investigating?" Matteo asked, though a cold dread was already forming in his stomach. "Giulia Moretti," Bruno said quietly. "Sir, I believe your father suspected she might be connected to your family somehow. Someone erased her birth history on purpose, and whoever did it had serious resources." Matteo stared at the folder for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities he didn't want to consider. "Find that nurse," Matteo said finally, his voice tight. "I need to know exactly what she told you." Meanwhile, across the city, a dying man named Salvatore lay in a dim apartment, his body wasting away from illness, his mind heavy with guilt he had carried for nearly 3 decades. Salvatore had once been a loyal driver and fixer for Vittorio Belandi, back in his younger, more reckless years. He knew secrets. Secrets he had promised to take to his grave. But as death crept closer, guilt outweighed loyalty. He called for Matteo. When Matteo arrived at the small, dimly lit apartment, Salvatore's hollow eyes studied him carefully. "You look like your father did, 30 years ago," Salvatore rasped. "You asked to see me," Matteo said. "Why?" Salvatore coughed painfully before continuing. "Because I am dying, and I cannot carry this secret any longer. It will follow me into hell if I do." "What secret?" "Your father," Salvatore whispered, "had a daughter. Before he married your mother. A woman named Carmela worked in one of the family's restaurants back then. Your father loved her, in his own way, but the family, his father, your grandfather, forbade the relationship. Said it would embarrass the Belandi name." Matteo's chest tightened. "They paid her to disappear," Salvatore continued. "Gave her enough money to start a new life far away, on the condition she never reveal who the father was. I was the one who drove her to the train station the night she left Naples. I was the one who handed her the envelope of cash." "What happened to the child?" Matteo asked, though he already feared the answer. "She was born months later," Salvatore said. "A girl. Carmela raised her alone. I only learned recently, through old contacts, what that girl's name became." "Say it," Matteo demanded, his voice shaking. Salvatore's eyes met his, filled with sorrow. "Giulia." Giulia Moretti is your father's daughter. She is your sister, Matteo. The room seemed to spin. Matteo staggered back a step, his mind refusing to accept what his ears had just heard. That's not possible, he whispered. I wish it wasn't, Salvatore said weakly. I am sorry, Matteo. I should have said something years ago. Please, forgive an old man's silence. Salvatore closed his eyes and did not open them again. Matteo drove back to the estate in a daze, the world around him blurred and distant. Every moment he had spent with Giulia replayed in his mind, every smile, every touch of her hand, every quiet dinner by the fireplace, now twisted into something sickening. He found Giulia waiting for him in the garden, smiling as she always did when she saw him. Matteo, what's wrong? She asked immediately, noticing the ghostly paleness of his face. We need to stop this, Matteo said, his voice cold and distant. Stop what? Whatever this is between us, Matteo said, stepping back from her. It ends now. Giulia's face fell, confusion and hurt flashing across her features. What are you talking about? Matteo, what happened? I can't explain right now, Matteo said, his jaw clenched tight. Just trust me. This has to end. He turned and walked away, leaving Giulia standing alone in the garden, tears welling in her eyes, utterly bewildered by the sudden, brutal shift in his behavior. She had no idea that the truth he carried was one that would soon shatter her entire world too. Matteo spent the following days in cold, controlled fury, burying his personal devastation beneath the urgent need to understand who else knew this secret, and who had been hiding it. He confronted his mother, Isabella Belandi, in her private quarters, the folder of altered records spread across the table between them. Mother, I need to know the truth, Matteo said. Did you know about Giulia? Did you know she was father's daughter? Isabella's face went pale, her composure, usually ironclad, cracking instantly. Where did you hear that? She asked quietly. So it's true, Matteo said, his voice low and dangerous. Isabella sank into a chair, her hands trembling. I found out years ago, she admitted. Long before you were even engaged to your first fiancé. I discovered old letters, payments your father had made to a woman named Carmela. I hired someone to investigate quietly. And when you learned the truth? Matteo pressed. I panicked, Isabella said, tears filling her eyes. Matteo, you must understand, if word ever got out that your father had an illegitimate daughter, it would have destroyed everything. Rival families would have used it as a weapon. They would have questioned your legitimacy, your right to inherit this empire. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let anyone find her. So you erased her existence, Matteo said, disgust dripping from his voice. You destroyed hospital records. You made sure a little girl's history disappeared, just to protect your own son's inheritance. I did it to protect you. Isabella cried. I did it because I love you more than my own life. I never imagined she would ever cross paths with this family again. I thought it was buried forever. Matteo stared at his mother, a woman he had always seen as strong, controlled, untouchable, now reduced to a trembling figure consumed by decades of guilt. You erased my sister's identity, Matteo said quietly. And you let me fall in love with her without ever telling me the truth. Isabella's sobs were the only response. Matteo turned and walked out, his heart a battlefield of grief, anger, and confusion he had no idea how to process. It had been Riccardo, working through hired hands and old contacts, who orchestrated the murder of two witnesses connected to Carmela Moretti's disappearance years earlier, witnesses who might have exposed the truth too soon, before Riccardo was ready to use it. It had been Riccardo who leaked Matteo's schedule to rival hitmen, hoping the assassination attempt would either eliminate Matteo entirely or, at the very least, create enough chaos and suspicion within the family to weaken his cousin's grip on power. And it had been Riccardo, years ago, who first discovered the truth about Giulia's parentage, long before Isabella ever did, and had been patiently waiting for the perfect moment to use that information as a weapon of ultimate destruction. Everything is falling into place, Riccardo told Carlo and Enzo during a private meeting in a dimly lit warehouse outside the city. Vittorio is in a coma. Matteo is broken over discovering his lover is his sister. Isabella's reputation within the family is destroyed once this gets out. The Belandi name is about to collapse under the weight of its own secrets. And once it collapses? Enzo asked. Riccardo smiled coldly. I step in to restore order. The loyal cousin who saves the family from ruin. They will hand me control without a fight. What Riccardo didn't count on was underestimating the very woman he had used as a pawn. Giulia, devastated and confused by Matteo's sudden rejection, refused to simply accept silence as an answer. She confronted Vittorio's personal nurse at the hospital, demanding information, and eventually cornered Bruno, the investigator, outside the hospital parking lot. Please, Giulia begged. Something happened. Matteo won't speak to me. Vittorio is in a coma. I deserve to know why my entire life is falling apart. Bruno, weighed down by guilt over his own role in triggering Vittorio's collapse, finally broke his silence. Miss Moretti, he said gently, I think you need to sit down. He told her everything, the altered birth records, the payment to her mother, the suspicion that Vittorio Belandi was her father. Giulia felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. That's not possible, she whispered, echoing the exact words Matteo had said days earlier. My mother she never said anything. Your mother was paid to stay silent, Bruno said quietly. For the rest of her life. Giulia sat on a cold bench outside the hospital, memories flooding back, her mother's tears whenever she asked about her father, the mysterious envelope of cash her mother kept hidden in a shoebox, the sudden trips to Naples every few years that her mother never explained. Pieces of a puzzle she never knew existed were finally clicking into place. Vittorio, she whispered. He's my father. And Matteo, the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had suddenly, cruelly ended everything between them, was her brother. The realization hit her like a physical blow, grief and horror crashing over her in waves. Giulia demanded to see Matteo, refusing to accept his silence any longer. She arrived at the Belandi estate, marching past confused guards until she found him standing alone in his father's study, staring blankly at the family portraits on the wall. You knew, she said, her voice trembling with betrayal. You knew, and you just walked away without explaining anything. Matteo turned, his eyes red-rimmed from days of sleeplessness and grief. Giulia, I had to hear it from a stranger, Giulia said, tears streaming down her face. I had to hear that my father is a mafia boss, that the man I fell in love with is my brother, from an investigator in a parking lot. I couldn't bring myself to say it, Matteo admitted quietly. I didn't know how. So instead you just abandoned me, Giulia said. Again. Just like everyone else in my life has done. Matteo stepped closer, his voice breaking. Giulia, I am so sorry. This is not what either of us wanted. I never meant to hurt you. Is he really my father? Giulia asked, her voice small. Matteo nodded slowly. It appears so. My mother confirmed it. She's the one who buried the records, all those years ago. To protect my inheritance. Giulia's legs nearly gave out beneath her. She sat down heavily in a nearby chair, her mind struggling to hold together the shattered pieces of everything she thought she knew about her life. All this time, she whispered, I thought I came from nothing. No family, no history, no one. And now I find out I'm connected to this. She gestured weakly around the grand study, at the family that had unknowingly stolen her identity, separated her from her father, and dragged her into a war she never asked to be part of. What happens now? She asked. Matteo sat across from her, his own grief mixing with a strange, painful relief at finally speaking the truth aloud. Now, Matteo said quietly, we find out who else knew, and why my father is lying in a hospital bed instead of telling us this himself. The final piece of the puzzle arrived from an unexpected source, Bruno, still digging through old records in an effort to atone for his part in Vittorio's collapse, discovered financial transfers linking Riccardo's private accounts to the two witnesses who had died mysteriously years earlier. These payments happened right before both witnesses disappeared, Bruno explained to Matteo, spreading documents across the desk. And look here, this payment, 3 weeks ago, right before your car was ambushed. Matteo's blood ran cold as he studied the documents. Riccardo. There's more, Bruno said. I traced an encrypted account. It shows regular contact between Riccardo and a rival family, the Count. He's been feeding them information for over a year, weakening your position slowly, patiently, while pretending loyalty. Matteo sat back, the full scope of the betrayal finally becoming clear. Riccardo hadn't simply been ambitious. He had been orchestrating a slow, methodical destruction of the entire Belandi family, using Giulia's hidden identity as the final weapon to shatter what remained of their unity. That night, Matteo called a private meeting, inviting Riccardo under the guise of discussing security improvements following the recent attacks. Riccardo arrived confident, unaware that Antonio and several loyal men were positioned throughout the room. Cousin, Riccardo said, smiling. You look tired. I've had a difficult few weeks, Matteo said calmly, sliding the financial documents across the table. Discovering my father has a hidden daughter. Discovering my mother buried that secret for decades. And discovering that my own cousin has been selling my family to the Count while orchestrating my assassination. Riccardo's smile faltered as he glanced down at the documents. Matteo, this is fabricated. Someone is trying to frame me, just like before. Save it, Matteo said coldly. You murdered the witnesses connected to Giulia's birth to protect your secret. You orchestrated the attack on my car. You've been planning to destroy this family from the inside for years, so you could step in and pick up the pieces. Ricardo's expression hardened, the mask of loyalty finally slipping away entirely. You have no idea what it's like, he spat, standing in your shadow for 15 years. Doing the dirty work while you got all the respect, all the power. I deserved better. You deserved nothing, Mateo said quietly. Loyalty was never about deserving. It was about honor. Something you never understood. Ricardo lunged suddenly, pulling a hidden weapon from his jacket, but Antonio was faster, disarming him before a single shot could be fired. Ricardo was dragged away, his desperate shouts echoing through the halls of the estate that he had so badly wanted to control. The traitor had finally been exposed. Days later, a miracle occurred. Vittorio Belandi's eyes fluttered open in his hospital bed, his body weak but his mind, remarkably, intact. Matteo and Giulia rushed to his bedside the moment they received the news. "Father," Matteo said, gripping the old man's frail hand. Vittorio's eyes moved slowly to Giulia, standing hesitantly at the foot of the bed. "Giulia," he whispered, a tear escaping the corner of his eye. "I knew it. The very first night, I knew there was something familiar about you. Your mother's eyes. Carmela's eyes. You suspected all along?" Giulia asked softly. "I chose to investigate quietly," Vittorio admitted, before saying anything to anyone. "I didn't want to disrupt your life until I was certain. I never imagined it would end this way." "You're my father," Giulia said, the words still strange and heavy on her tongue. "Yes," Vittorio said. "And I am so sorry for every year you grew up without me, without knowing where you truly came from. Your mother protected you by staying silent. I only wish I had found you sooner." Giulia's tears fell freely now, decades of unanswered questions finally finding their resolution, even as new, more painful truths took their place. "What happens to Ricardo?" Vittorio asked, his voice weak but sharp with old authority. "He's been dealt with," Matteo said simply. "The family is safe. For now." Vittorio nodded slowly, exhaustion pulling at his features. "This family has caused you both so much pain," he murmured. "I only hope, in time, we can build something better from what remains." In the weeks that followed, the Belandi Empire underwent a quiet, careful restructuring. Isabella, consumed by guilt, stepped back from her role within the family entirely, choosing instead to spend her remaining days trying, in her own broken way, to make amends with Giulia, a slow, painful process neither woman expected to fully heal. Matteo, now carrying the full weight of both leading the family and processing the loss of the romance he once believed he'd found, threw himself into rebuilding what Ricardo's betrayal had nearly destroyed. Giulia, no longer just a forgotten waitress from a quiet Naples street, found herself standing at the edge of an entirely new life, a life she never asked for, filled with wealth and family, but also danger and unimaginable loss. She returned to the restaurant one final evening, tying her apron around her waist one last time, staring at the small dining room that had once been her entire world before everything changed. Sofia, her old coworker, approached with a curious smile. "So it's true? You're really leaving?" "I have a family now," Giulia said quietly. "A strange, complicated, dangerous family. But it's mine." "And the Mafia boss?" Sofia asked, lowering her voice. "The one everyone's been whispering about?" Giulia's expression flickered, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. "He's not what I thought he was," she said. "But then again, neither am I." She removed her apron one final time, folding it neatly on the counter, and walked toward the door. As she stepped outside into the cool Naples evening, a familiar black car waited by the curb. The window rolled down, and Matteo looked out at her, his expression carefully composed, betraying nothing of the storm still raging quietly beneath the surface. "Ready to go home?" he asked simply. Giulia paused for a moment, looking back one last time at the small restaurant that had once been the center of her entire existence, before smiling faintly and climbing into the car beside the brother she had almost loved as something else entirely. "Yes," she said quietly. "I'm ready." The car pulled away into the darkness, carrying two people bound by blood, secrets, and a truth that would forever change how they saw each other, and themselves. And that's how a simple act of kindness in a small Naples restaurant unraveled 30 years of secrets, betrayal, and a family built on lies. If you enjoyed this story, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments what you learned from this story. Turn on notifications so you never miss an episode.